The file on the mahogany desk in Washington, D.C. was stamped with a single, ominous word in red ink: confidential. Inside, amidst the dry bureaucracy of government paper, lay the dynamite that could blow the entire facade of 1950s America to pieces. It was 1955, and while the world saw Rock Hudson as the virile giant of the silver screen, the man who made women swoon and men envious, the Federal Bureau of Investigation saw something else entirely. They saw a liability. They saw a secret so volatile that J. Edgar Hoover himself kept the dossier within arm's reach. The cameras flashed on the red carpet in Los Angeles, blinding in their intensity, capturing the perfect smile of Hollywood's golden boy. But they failed to capture the terror lurking just behind his eyes. Rock Hudson was not merely an actor playing a role. He was a prisoner in a golden cage, constructed by the studio system and guarded by the most ruthless men in the industry. But the walls of that cage were beginning to crack, and the sound of the fracture was a reel of magnetic tape spinning slowly in a dark room, recording a voice that was never meant to be heard. This was the era when a single whisper could end a life, and the silence around Rock Hudson was about to be broken by the loudest scream in Hollywood history. To understand the magnitude of the threat, one must first understand the architecture of the illusion. Rock Hudson was not born, he was manufactured. Born Roy Scherer Jr., a simple truck driver from Winnetka, Illinois, he had been sculpted into a deity by Henry Wilson, a legendary agent known as much for his predatory instincts as for his star-making genius. Wilson had changed his name, fixed his teeth, lowered his voice, and taught him how to walk like a cowboy. But there was one thing Wilson could not change: the young man's heart. In the deep, velvet shadows of the Hollywood Hills, away from the prying lenses of the gossip columnists, Hudson lived a life that was technically a crime in the United States. And the FBI knew it. The Bureau didn't need to investigate. They simply needed to listen. The files reveal a disturbing reality where government surveillance and entertainment industry cover-ups walked hand in hand. Agents were not protecting the star. They were collecting collateral. Every illicit party, every private phone call, every late-night visitor was cataloged, not for justice, but for leverage. The tension reached a breaking point not in a courtroom, but in the smoke-filled editorial offices of Confidential magazine. This was the publication that struck fear into the hearts of studio moguls, a tabloid that didn't just print rumors. They printed destruction. They had received a tip, a lead so hot it threatened to burn down Universal Pictures. The rumor was that Rock Hudson, America's most eligible bachelor, was living a lie. But rumors were one thing, proof was another. And suddenly, proof existed. It wasn't a photograph or a letter. It was a recording. A private investigator, a former cop named Fred Otash, who operated in the gray zones where the law didn't apply, had allegedly secured audio evidence of Hudson in a compromising situation with another man. The existence of this tape was the nuclear option. If it was played, the career of the biggest star in the world would evaporate instantly, replaced by a prison sentence and eternal disgrace. But the studio machine was not going to let their investment die without a war, and the first battle was fought with cold, hard cash. Universal Pictures was in a panic. The executives held emergency meetings at midnight, the air thick with cigar smoke and desperation. They weren't just protecting a man, they were protecting millions of dollars in future box office receipts. The strategy was brutal and simple: kill the story at any cost. Henry Wilson, the man who had created the monster of fame, was now tasked with taming it. He reached out to his contacts in the underworld, men who knew how to make problems disappear. The FBI files suggest a flurry of activity during this period, frantic calls between Los Angeles and Washington. Was the Bureau helping to suppress the evidence, or were they waiting to see the Titan fall? The ambiguity of their involvement makes the narrative even more chilling. They watched as the studio prepared to offer a sacrificial lamb to the tabloids, anything to distract from the Hudson story. The psychological toll on Hudson was immense. Imagine standing on a film set, portraying the ultimate romantic hero, kissing the most beautiful women in the world, while knowing that a single reel of tape in a detective's safe could destroy you. He became paranoid, trusting no one. Every phone click, every strange car parked on his street sent shivers down his spine. He was living in a Hitchcock thriller of his own making. The pressure was physical. He began to drink more, his hands shaking slightly before the director called action. He was a man acting for his life 24 hours a day. The FBI agents monitoring him noted his erratic behavior. The late-night drives to nowhere. The desperate attempts to find moments of authentic connection in a world that demanded total artifice. Then came the ultimatum that would change everything, a message delivered not by a lawyer, but by a ghost from the past. A meeting was arranged in a secluded location, far from the glitz of the Sunset Strip. The demands were clear. The tape would disappear. The story in Confidential would be killed, but the price would be heavy. It wasn't just money they wanted a narrative shift. They needed Rock Hudson to do the one thing he had avoided for years, get married. It was the ultimate cover-up, a state-sanctioned lie to silence the whispers. The FBI files contained vague references to this arrangement, a chilling acknowledgement that the government was aware of the forced marriage plot. The plan was to wed Hudson to Phyllis Gates, Henry Wilson's own secretary, a woman who allegedly knew nothing of the dark machinations swirling around her. It was a cynical, cruel, and desperate move. As the wedding was planned with military precision, the shadow of the blackmail tape still loomed. Where was it? Who actually held it? Was it Otash, the private eye? Or was it someone closer, someone within the studio who wanted insurance? The fear that the tape might have been copied, that it might resurface even after the ransom was paid, haunted Hudson. He was walking down the aisle, not towards happiness, but towards a prison of a different kind. The FBI watched it all unfold, their agents compiling reports on the wedding of the year, fully aware that it was a sham orchestrated to deceive the American public. The disconnect between the smiling couple on the magazine covers and the terrifying reality of extortion and surveillance creates a sense of vertigo. However, deep in the archives, there was a second file, one that J. Edgar Hoover didn't share with anyone, containing a secret far darker than a simple affair. While the studio focused on the sex scandal, the FBI was looking at something else. There were whispers of connections to figures that the government deemed subversive. In the paranoia of the Cold War, a closeted man was the perfect target for foreign blackmail. The Bureau wasn't just worried about Hudson's morality, they were worried about his vulnerability. If the tabloids could extort him, so could the Soviets. This elevated the Rock Hudson case from a Hollywood scandal to a matter of national security. The files hinted interrogations that never made the official record, late-night visits by men in dark suits who asked questions not about his love life, but about his loyalty. Hudson was caught in a pincer movement, the studio on one side threatening his career, and the FBI on the other threatening his freedom. As 1955 drew to a close, Rock Hudson was the biggest star in the world and the loneliest man in America. The blackmailers had been paid, the marriage had been performed, and the magazine had been silenced. But the tape was never officially destroyed. It remained out there, a ghost in the machine, a sword of Damocles hanging over his head by a thread that grew thinner with each passing year. The public saw a king, but the FBI files recorded the trembling of a man who knew that his entire existence was built on a fault line. And deep in the suppressed evidence, there was a reference to a specific conversation, a recording made on a rainy Tuesday that contained an admission so personal, so raw, that it would have humanized him in a way the world wasn't ready to accept. The silence had been bought, but the receipt was kept in a government vault, waiting for the day the payments would stop. The honeymoon was a performance, a grotesque parody of intimacy staged for the flashbulbs of the paparazzi who followed them from Los Angeles to Jamaica. Rock Hudson and Phyllis Gates, the golden couple of 1955, smiled until their jaws ached, holding hands with a grip that was less about affection and more about mutual survival. But as the hotel door clicked shut and the heavy tropical air settled around them, the silence that filled the room was deafening. The FBI files from this period note a curious lack of genuine interaction, observing that the subject appeared more like a man guarding a prisoner than a husband on a romantic getaway. For Hudson, this marriage was not a new chapter. It was a fortress built to keep the truth at bay. But he soon realized that the most dangerous enemy wasn't outside the walls. She was sleeping in the bed next to him. Phyllis, initially oblivious to the machinations of Henry Wilson, began to notice the cracks in the porcelain perfection of their life. The late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, the strange business meetings that lasted until dawn, and the cold, impenetrable distance in her husband's eyes were pieces of a puzzle she was terrified to solve. The domestic bliss sold to the American public was, in reality, a psychological pressure cooker waiting to explode. Back in the Hollywood Hills, the charade became a daily torture. The studio had provided the script, but they hadn't accounted for the human variable. Hudson was suffocating. Every moment of his existence was now a lie. He had to be the rugged, heteronormative icon while eating breakfast, the devoted husband while reading the evening paper, all while knowing that J. Edgar Hoover's agents were documenting his associates. The Bureau's interest hadn't waned with the wedding. If anything, it had intensified. They were waiting for the slip-up. They knew that a man living under such immense pressure would eventually seek an outlet, and they intended to be there when he did. The files contain redacted reports of suspicious gatherings at Hudson's residence, coded language for the private pool parties where the mask could momentarily slip. These weren't just parties. They were acts of rebellion against a system that demanded his soul in exchange for his fame. The tension reached a breaking point in 1957. Phyllis Gates was not a fool. She was a woman who realized she had been cast in a role she never auditioned for. The arguments in the Hudson household grew loud enough to worry the studio fixers. Henry Wilson, the architect of this disaster, found himself playing marriage counselor to a union he had fabricated. He knew that a messy divorce could be just as damaging as the initial scandal. If Phyllis spoke, if she stood up in a court of law and declared the marriage a sham, the confidential story would look like a nursery rhyme compared to the reality. The studio executives trembled. They had millions invested in A Farewell to Arms and Giant. They could not afford for their leading man to be unmasked. The negotiations that followed were cold and transactional. It was a poker game where the stakes were Rock Hudson's life, and Phyllis held the royal flush. But the studio had a weapon of its own, the power to destroy anyone who dared to challenge the narrative. The divorce in 1958 was orchestrated with the precision of a military coup. The official reason given was mental cruelty, a vague legal term that covered a multitude of sins without revealing any specific truth. Phyllis walked away with a settlement that secured her silence, but the emotional debris was left for Hudson to clear alone. He was single again, but the landscape had changed. The 1960s were approaching a decade of revolution and sexual liberation, yet Hudson remained trapped in the rigid morality of the 1950s. While the youth of America burned their draft cards and embraced free love, Rock Hudson had to remain the stoic, unattainable bachelor. The FBI files from this era show a shift in tone. They stopped viewing him merely as a security risk and started viewing him as a curiosity, a relic of a dying system. However, the danger was far from over. As Hudson aged, the playboy excuse began to wear thin. A man in his 40s who never remarried, who lived with another man under the guise of a secretary or houseboy, sparked whispers that were harder to suppress. The blackmailers didn't disappear. They just changed their tactics. The underworld figures who held the original tapes saw a recurring revenue stream. There are gaps in the timeline of Hudson's finances. Large cash withdrawals that correspond with periods of heightened rumors. Was he paying for silence for decades? The tragedy of Rock Hudson is not just that he lived a lie, but that he paid for the privilege of that lie every single day. He built the castle, his mansion on the hill, not as a home, but as a sanctuary where he could breathe. But even the thickest walls couldn't keep out the changing tides of history, and a new invisible threat was already circulating in the veins of the city. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Hudson reinvented himself on television with McMillan and Wife. It was a brilliant move, placing him right back in the American living room as the trusted authority figure. But behind the scenes, the double life was becoming more reckless. The FBI reports suggest that Hudson, perhaps emboldened by his survival or exhausted by the secrecy, began to take risks he never would have taken in his youth. He ventured into the underground gay scene of San Francisco and New York, places where anonymity was promised but never guaranteed. In a world before digital surveillance, he relied on the shadows, but the Bureau had long memories. They kept the file open. They knew that the Rock Hudson the public loved was a construct that was becoming increasingly unstable. The ultimate irony was that while the FBI watched for communist ties or moral corruption, they missed the true tragedy unfolding. They were documenting the life of a man who was desperately lonely, searching for connection in a world that told him his love was a crime. The recordings, the photos, the surveillance logs, they are not evidence of a crime, they are the biography of a ghost. A ghost who walked the red carpet, signed the autographs, and smiled that million-dollar smile, all while carrying the weight of a secret that was slowly crushing his spirit. As the disco era dawned, bringing with it a hedonism that would eventually lead to catastrophe, Rock Hudson was about to enter the final, most dangerous act of his life. And in the darkness of an archive room, a dusty tape reel sat on a shelf, a ticking time bomb that had yet to detonate. The transition into the 1970s offered a deceptive sense of security. Rock Hudson had successfully migrated from the silver screen to the small screen, entering millions of American homes every week as the charming police commissioner in McMillan and Wife. To the public, he was ageless, the eternal symbol of masculine stability. But the FBI files from this decade reveal a different narrative. One of a man navigating a world that was rapidly unraveling. The surveillance had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. The dossier was no longer just about moral turpitude. It was becoming a chronicle of a reckless double life that was spilling out of the shadows. San Francisco, the setting of his hit show, was also the epicenter of a cultural earthquake. Hudson, emboldened by decades of evading exposure, began to venture into the Castro district, the beating heart of the gay liberation movement. He was walking a tightrope between two universes, the conservative living rooms of Middle America and the liberated streets of San Francisco. The agents noted the irony. The man playing the top cop was frequenting places the police were actively raiding. But the danger was no longer just about reputation. It was about to become biological. The early 1980s arrived with a silence that was louder than any scream. A mysterious illness was sweeping through the community Hudson secretly belonged to, a cancer that struck down young, healthy men. In the corridors of power in Washington, the same men who had once monitored Hudson for subversive behavior were now reading classified reports about a virus that had no name and no cure. Did the FBI know before the doctors? The timeline suggests that the government was aware of the pattern long before the public panic set in. Hudson, however, was in denial. He was the invincible Rock Hudson. He had survived the studio system, the blackmailers, and the sham marriage. He believed he could survive this too. But in June 1984, a small purple lesion appeared on his neck. It was the mark of the beast, the undeniable signature of Kaposi's sarcoma. The cover-up that followed was the most desperate performance of his career. The official story was a heart bypass, a socially acceptable ailment for an aging star. But the truth was hidden in medical files that were guarded as fiercely as nuclear codes. It was during this terrifying period that Hudson made a decision that would later be branded as criminal negligence by some and tragic desperation by others. He accepted a role on the hit soap opera Dynasty. He needed to work. He needed to prove he was still alive, still viable, still Rock Hudson. But he was a walking biological time bomb, and he knew it. The set of Dynasty became the stage for a scene that would haunt Hollywood history. The script called for a passionate kiss with Linda Evans. In 1984, the transmission vectors of AIDS were not fully understood. Fear was the dominant currency. Hudson, gaunt and terrified, stood on the soundstage, the lights bearing down on him like an interrogation lamp. He was gargling with every disinfectant he could find, his mouth burning, his heart pounding against his ribs. The dilemma was excruciating: refuse the kiss and reveal his secret, or go through with it and risk the unthinkable. The footage of that scene shows a stiffness, a hesitation that the audience interpreted as dramatic tension, but which in reality was pure, unadulterated terror. He kissed her, but he kept his lips sealed tight, a physical manifestation of the secrets he was holding in. Back at the castle, the walls were closing in. A new figure had entered the dossier: Mark Christian, a young, handsome lover who was living with Hudson, completely unaware of the death sentence hanging in the air. The FBI files, if they were still being updated, would have recorded a tragedy in motion. Hudson continued to sleep next to Christian, maintaining the illusion of health while his body was consuming itself. It was a betrayal born of fear, a selfishness driven by the absolute terror of being alone in the face of death. The perfect gentleman was effectively playing Russian roulette with another man's life. The silence was about to break, not with a whisper, but with a collapse that would be heard around the world. By July 1985, the facade was crumbling. Hudson traveled to Paris seeking a miracle cure, a treatment that the FDA hadn't approved. He wasn't looking for publicity, he was looking for salvation. But the paparazzi, those vultures who had circled him for 30 years, smelled blood. When he collapsed at the Ritz Hotel, the image that was beamed across the globe was not of the handsome giant, but of a frail, confused old man. The press release was drafted. The lies about anorexia, about heart problems, about exhaustion, they were all on the table. But Hudson, lying in a hospital bed in a foreign land, looked at his publicist and made the choice that J. Edgar Hoover had spent decades trying to prevent. He decided to tell the truth. The file was about to be closed, not by the government, but by the victim himself. July 25, 1985 began as just another summer day in Los Angeles. But by evening, the tectonic plates of American culture had shifted irrevocably. In Paris, a trembling publicist stood before a ravenous press corps and read a statement that did the unthinkable. It shattered the mask. Rock Hudson has acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The words hung in the air, heavy and radioactive. The FBI files, kept secret for decades, suddenly became obsolete. The truth was no longer a whispered rumor in a Hoover memo. It was a headline screaming from every newsstand in the world. The impact was nuclear. The perfect American male, the man who had symbolized strength and virility for 3 generations, was dying of the gay plague. In homes across the Midwest, the denial that had protected Hudson for 30 years evaporated instantly. The monster in the closet wasn't just real, it had a face, and that face was Rock Hudson. But the final act of this tragedy was not played out on a screen. It was a lonely flight across the Atlantic that cost $250,000. No commercial airline would touch him. He was treated like a biological hazard, a leper in a designer suit. Hudson had to charter a private Boeing 747 just to come home to die. Picture the scene: a massive aircraft designed to carry 400 people, soaring over the ocean with only a handful of passengers, a dying star, his doctors, and the crushing weight of his mortality. He lay on a stretcher, drifting in and out of consciousness, flying back to the city that had made him a king, knowing that the kingdom was now terrified of him. When he arrived at UCLA Medical Center, the fear was palpable. Nurses were afraid to enter his room. Food trays were left at the door. It was a brutal reflection of the ignorance of the time. The man who had once been surrounded by adoring fans was now isolated by a glass wall of panic. Yet, in this darkness, a beacon of loyalty emerged: Elizabeth Taylor. While the rest of Hollywood retreated, scrubbing their address books and issuing no-comment statements, Taylor marched into the hospital room. She held his hand, the hand the world was afraid to touch. And in doing so, she shamed the industry into action. It was the beginning of her crusade, but for Hudson, it was a final, fleeting comfort. He was moved back to the castle in Beverly Hills, the fortress built on secrets, to spend his final days. The phone, once silent, now rang incessantly, but it was too late. The body that had been insured for millions was failing. On October 2nd, 1985, the struggle ended. Rock Hudson died in his sleep weeks before his 60th birthday. The official statement said he was at peace, but the legal war was just beginning. The death of Rock Hudson was not the end of the scandal. It was the trigger for the ultimate betrayal. Mark Christian, the lover who had shared Hudson's bed during the final terrifying years, filed a lawsuit that would rip the remaining shred of dignity from Hudson's legacy. He sued the estate for emotional distress, claiming that Hudson had knowingly exposed him to the virus. The courtroom became a theater of cruelty. The details were sordid and heartbreaking. The jury heard how the great romantic hero, paralyzed by the fear of being outed, continued to have sexual relations with Christian while knowing he was a carrier of death. It was a revelation that painted Hudson not as a victim, but as a villain driven by a selfish, desperate need for comfort. The jury awarded Christian millions of dollars, a final, cynical transaction in a life defined by paid silence. However, history has a way of rewriting the ending. As the dust settled on the lawsuits and the tabloids moved on to the next victim, the true magnitude of Hudson's sacrifice became clear. His death did what his life could not. It forced America to look AIDS in the eye. Before Rock Hudson, it was a disease of others, the marginalized, the invisible. After Rock Hudson, it was a disease that could kill the boy next door, the movie star, the hero. President Reagan, who had remained silent for years as thousands died, was finally forced to speak the word AIDS in public. Funding for research skyrocketed. The tragedy of one man became the catalyst for the survival of millions. Today, the FBI files are just dusty paper, relics of an era of paranoia and persecution. The blackmail tapes have long since rotted away, but the image of Rock Hudson remains complex and haunting. He was a creation of Hollywood who was destroyed by the very system that built him. He was a liar who eventually told the most important truth of the century. In the end, Henry Wilson's greatest invention wasn't the star Rock Hudson. It was the tragedy that his death revealed. The man who spent his entire life pretending to be someone else finally became the most authentic version of himself in his final gasping breath. The mask didn't just slip, it was smashed, and in the ruins, the world found a harsh, necessary light.